You've spent today hearing many stories of success, successful analyses, successful geospatial strategies executed, successful things done. I feel like when you go to conferences, when you read scientific papers, when you read most of the things that are out there, you tend to see, oh, like these are the things that worked. This is the study that had a significant result. And I think that can teach you that there are many ways to be successful. But I think there are many more ways to mess up. So I would like to share a story where things didn't quite work out the way I would like, in order to give you some concrete, actionable advice on how to actually build geospatial capabilities if you don't have them in the first place. I think this will be especially applicable if it's relatively new in your organization, and if your organization is perhaps on the older side, or they're not geospatial first, right? You're trying to bring in something new. So does anybody recognize this quote, like the structure of this quote, where it comes from? Yes? If you do, raise your hand. You recognize this? Yes, it's Anna Karenina, the first line, right? Geospatial successes are all alike. Every geospatial failure fails in its own way. Is it true? Guess we'll find out. So let me give you a little bit of setup. Geospatial was a new capability. I was hired to create a new data science team embedded in a shared services organization. This is a shared service for Blackstone's global real estate portfolio. They own, I think, over 900 billion assets under management right now in real estate across the globe, across every commercial asset class. So they're like the opportunity there is to do analyses with private data that no one else has is pretty enormous, right? The opportunity to find patterns using geospatial thinking is also perhaps greater than almost anywhere else, right? So here's the thing. They buy real estate assets, different companies, different asset classes. These companies have different histories. They have wildly different data positions, wildly different data maturities, right? Some of them are, all on-prem. Some of them don't even understand the value of cloud or what cloud is. They're used to doing business in a certain way, right? And to bring it forward to do something else, you have to actually bring them along the journey. And that's something I didn't realize. And I'm going to get into why. Mostly they were focused on understanding their internal data. Okay, how many properties do we have? How many units are in those properties? It's surprisingly difficult to answer this question when you have acquired assets from different companies and it's sitting in different data warehouses or not a warehouse at all, or Excel sheets or shared network drives or anything like that, right? So when I came in, I saw this and I thought I had this clever idea. I said, why don't we skip that internal data stuff and help them all at once by bringing in and enriching their data with geospatial and external data, right? Kind of like what you might get through the data observatory in Carta. So I figured if I just had the locations of places, I could then take external data, enrich it, those locations, and then do some interesting analyses like network analyses, drive time stuff, things with isochrones like some of the stuff you've been hearing today, right? It was very much in that vein. And I even had senior leadership bought in. So we did one capability, data enrichment and capability focused proof of concept with Carto at the end of 2019 and early 2020. And when we finished presenting it, a senior leader, a head architect, said, of course, we need geospatial. That's a given. So what happened? So I thought about it a lot, and I broke it down into four factors that contributed to not succeeding with actually getting it off the ground and turning it into something that was a product regularly used by our customers, our stakeholders, meaning the folks in the portfolio companies running the real estate assets or doing some of the asset management around it. I call it putting scale first, the coolness factor, the pandemi-pocalypse, and turnover. So here's the thing. Each of these factors contributed to us not succeeding, but each of these could have been turned around, actually, to make it even more necessary. And I'll get into what I would have done instead at the end. So putting scale first. So I had this idea of taking all these properties, doing an analysis that would work across the portfolio companies, right? I would do like calculate isochrones, get the population demographic data on a very small scale, and then sort of use those as features in machine learning to do predictions. This was my idea, right? And I thought it was cool because it doesn't matter who the portfolio company was, whether they were hotels, whether they were retail, whether they were logistics. I could take these same data, use these same analyses, almost the same code, turn it on to just put something different as a dependent variable, and then create some prediction, at least get some baseline, right? And I thought we could do this while skipping the hard work of cleaning the internal data, which other people were doing. So I figured, why not skip that, right? The thing is, the portfolio companies are not used to thinking that way. They're used to operating just in their asset class. So logistics is thinking about logistics. Hotels are thinking about hotels. By trying to appeal to everyone, I appealed to no one. If you start by thinking of scale first, people they're not necessarily like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense, like sign me up. They care about like, what are my specific problems, and can you solve my specific problems first? If you do that, but you also have scale for step 2 in mind, that makes it a lot easier to actually get the buy-in. But by putting scale first and thinking, what is the one thing I could do that would help everyone, I ended up not necessarily building the buy-in with the people I needed to in order to get it past the proof of concept stage. The lesson here, I think, is to focus not just on potential value, but to focus on urgency, so pain, a problem you're solving, the urgency, meaning how fast should they solve it? If they don't solve it by X time, will there be a challenge? And specificity, a very specific problem. So, the coolness factor. The thing I explained to you, when I first came to this conference in 2019, I thought, wow, this is super cool. Look at all these amazing things you could do, all the presentations that you guys have seen today. It felt like a revelation to me, and I immediately saw like, oh, I could turn those things into features. Like I'm a data scientist by background, so I thought, well, why don't we do that and like get to the data science part, right? And I especially focused on enrichment data, things like anonymized credit card transactions and location. It sounds super cool, right? And if you come here and you see analysis with that, you might think, wait, I can just jump to that part, right? Can I just like do that first, right? Isn't that the most fun? But in fact, if you do that, but you don't actually link it to a real problem, people are not going to actually spend the hundreds of thousands of dollars, in the budget required to bring it to fruition, to make it a real thing, right? People had basic questions like, how many properties do we have? What are the rents? Should we increase the rent or not? They had these questions. I didn't start from them, I started from me. And this also contributed to not getting the buy-in required to make a real geospatial project go forward. So the lesson here, I think, is to focus on problems and then tie the coolness factor, some capability that you think that you don't have, that you think you really want, like say graph, which was another thing we were thinking about at the time, or geospatial, tie it to the problem. So start with the problem first. I would not say start with the problem only, which sometimes I hear this advice when thinking of sort of capability building strategies, data strategies, because ultimately you can't figure out what you can work on unless you know what your capabilities can do. What can geospatial do? What can it not do, right? So you have to have some understanding of that, but then look for problems, right, that you could apply that to. So the pandemic, right? So that changed priorities pretty rapidly with everyone involved. And basically at that time, we pivoted as well to doing an analysis related to COVID and then eventually towards financial forecasting, right? As these were the most useful, immediate value add things that the people we were serving would have. So what I realized when I look back on that and I think, well, we had to pivot away from geospatial, I realized that when you think that, it means it was a nice to have all along, right? That means that there was not a case for specificity and urgency in order to actually make it more important now that COVID hit. I mean, there's so much, if you think, I mean, you even saw analysis before related to COVID and geospatial. There's so much you could do. COVID could have been the golden opportunity to actually push forward, think of a new analysis that would be really tied to something specific and urgent. But we ended up not doing that, right? So here, this was a blocker because it changed priorities away, but it could have actually been an aid if we thought about it differently. The lesson here is that no one buys things that are nice to have. No one buys things just because they are cool. Crises are actually opportunities to get what you want by recontextualizing its value, right? For example, we were doing forecasting of hotel occupancy, right? And we were using very basic features, the lagged values of the time series, other time series, things like that. But if we had said, wait a minute, maybe there's some, maybe we should get some mobility data to see who might be going to our different assets and try to see the drop in that. That could have been a good value-added exercise to do geospatial during COVID. All right, the final thing is turnover. And this is sort of related to COVID, the Great Resignation, right? So we had we had senior leaders at the time, and most of them left within the year, within 2020, right? And so you might remember that quote I had at the beginning. They said, geospatial, of course. The senior leader said, yeah, of course, you need this. We need this. This is like a given. It's so obvious, right? That person left. And what happens if all the people who were bought into your idea leave? How do you actually continue to get the buy-in to move forward with what you have? The answer is, if your customers, the people you are serving, continue to advocate for you, then it doesn't really matter, right? If you have a customer and you figured out a pretty good use case with them, then even if your senior leadership turnover, you still have people who want what you're selling. But because they left and I'd only focused on them, my bosses, we basically would have had to start from scratch, mostly from scratch. So the lesson is to build my users and customers, not just leadership. So what I would have done, and I'm going to summarize this, and then I think then I'll take questions. So I would focus firstly on customers and not capabilities. So if you were in a shared service environment like we are, people were not necessarily asking for data science. So there's a catch-22 where you have to think, how do I build demand for this thing that they're not asking for in the first place? The answer is that, well, you probably come up with little proofs of concept, little things tied to the most specific urgent problem you can think of, show them, and then iterate on that. Because coming to them with a little bit of extra work generally is a lot better than just having some sort of cool idea, right? So I would have defined a proof of concept with the customers, not focused on the initial scale, but focused on the initial urgency and specificity of the problem. The second one is start small. One specific problem, one geospatial data source or capability to solve it. I was focused on the data observatory bringing many kinds of data together initially. But when I pitch that to people, it's a lot more difficult to do an inexpensive proof of concept doing that, right? Say, oh, I want to have all this data, and then we'll see what the data say. Instead, what I should have done is try to understand more about the business of the people we're serving, and then propose this one data source that could have helped them do better, right? The third thing, and this is mostly for people who are not in data or AI-first startups, is to improve something that people already do. So if you are totally lost, like I was, for the first project to do when bringing on geospatial, or in general, any new capability, what I would do is look at what people are already doing and then figure out a place you could inject a new capability to scale them. That means partly automate what they do, partly allow them to spend less time and get more done doing that thing before focusing on net new capabilities, right? So if they're manually looking for information on a thing, what you can do is start to ingest that information in an automated fashion. And if you're doing ML, say extract features from that, if it's news or text or like the interest rates or whatever, start to ingest that and make it useful to them, and then you iterate on that, right? One good place to look is reports that people already create. So if they're already generating reports, sending important emails to people like on a regular basis, right? It's a lot of reporting requirements, right, in what we do. You might start there, look at the data that they use, and then think, is there something that could make this report better, right? That could help us get from just, and then you give them that data, and then you can move from there to start making predictions. Like, what if we take away not if we not just give you the data, but what if we actually make a prediction and point at the thing you're trying to use this data for, right? So by starting from where people already are in a very concrete way, you can actually create a lot more buy-in a lot more quickly. And yes, your answer will depend on your environment. So this is generally, what I'm talking about is stuff I've learned in larger organizations. When you're trying to bring on a new capability and no one's asking for it, it's literally like starting from scratch, right? A lot of you guys are in a more lucky situation in that respect. Maybe the capabilities are more mature. Maybe you already have buy-in for like the big, bold things. But if you don't have that, you do have to start somewhere. And once you deliver on those smaller things, then you can build the buy-in for the bigger things. But ultimately, the key variable, I guess it's the closest thing I can think of to what causes this, is the leadership familiarity with the value of the capability, right? If they're already familiar with the value, then you can go big sooner. If they are not, you have to start small. So that's all for me, and I'll take questions if there's time.